the honey wasn't to preserve him. The honey was so the Sultan could look at a dead man's face without smelling what 3 weeks of winter rot does to human flesh. The jar arrived in Constantinople sealed with wax that had cracked in the cold. The official who opened it had done this before. He'd opened jars containing the heads of men who'd defied the Sultan. He'd opened jars containing the heads of women who'd refused to convert. He'd opened jars containing children. He didn't flinch. He reached into the honey with both hands. Imagine that texture, thick and granular from the cold, clinging to your skin like it doesn't want to let go. And he lifted. The head came up slow, honey stretched in strands. It dripped back into the jar with a sound you don't want to think about. He set it on a silver tray. The silver was cold, the face was cold, the honey was cold, and the eyes were open. The mustache was intact. The expression frozen on that face wasn't battle fury, it wasn't defiance. It wasn't the face of a man who died fighting Turks on a frozen field outside Bucharest. It was the face of a man who saw it coming. Who saw who was coming, and that's the part they cut from every textbook. The official report, the one that survived, the one you learned, the one stamped and sealed and repeated for 500 goddamn years, said Vlad III Dracula, voivode of Wallachia, died fighting Ottomans in a cavalry engagement in late December 1476. Brave, noble, clean. Enemy blade, end of story. 3 contemporary chroniclers said something else. 3 men who were alive when it happened, who wrote it down while the blood was still wet in the snow, said he was killed by his own men. His own. And the version that survived, the version that made it into encyclopedias, that version was written by the men who killed him, or the men who paid for it, or the men who needed it to look like something else. Wait. Think about that for a second. The people who benefited from Vlad Dracula being dead, and there were many, we'll get to that, got to write the official story of how he died. And for 5 centuries no one questioned it hard enough to make it stick. The fragments of what actually happened were never destroyed. They were scattered, buried in a Russian diplomat's letters no one read, scribbled in the margins of a Moldavian monk's manuscript, hidden in the silence of 3 men who saw the head before the public did. They've been sitting in archives this entire time. No one ever put them in the same room. If documented truth still means anything to you, if the idea that powerful men can rewrite how a prince died and get away with it for half a millennium makes something in your chest go cold, subscribe. Stay close. This is the work, and there's more of it coming. The honey was a cover. Here's the version every history book agrees on. Autumn 1476, Vlad III returns to power for the 3rd time, supported by Stephen the Great of Moldavia, his cousin, supposedly, and Hungarian commander Stephen Bathory. They take Targovic on November 8, Bucharest falls on the 16th. Basarabaleoti, the Ottoman-backed pretender who'd been warming the throne, runs south across the Danube. Vlad is crowned before November 26th. His allies, satisfied, job done, winter coming, march their armies home. Within weeks, Leoches returns with Ottoman reinforcements. Vlad rides out with a small force to meet him. He's killed somewhere on the road between Bucharest and Giurgiu. His head is cut from his body, packed in honey, sent to Sultan Mehmed II in Constantinople, displayed on a stake. That's the version. Neat, clean, repeatable. His head was cut from his body. There's a problem. The problem is that no 2 contemporary sources agree on who killed him. The problem is that the man who supposedly led the Ottoman counter-invasion is described completely differently in different chronicles. Sometimes a commander, sometimes a ghost, sometimes not mentioned at all. The problem is that the most cited account of Vlad's death, the Russian narrative attributed to diplomat Fyodor Kurytsin, was written years after the events by a man who arrived in the region long after Vlad was already rotting, or preserved, depending on which part of him you're talking about. The earliest contemporary accounts contradict each other on one specific point. They disagree on whether Vlad was killed by Ottomans, by his own boyars, or accidentally by his own men in the confusion of battle. Most people stop reading here. That's why the simplified version keeps surviving. Hold on to that detail. 3 versions, written by men who were alive when it happened, all disagreeing, it returns. There were 4 contemporary accounts of Vlad's death produced within 2 decades of the event. They cannot all be true. First account, Italian humanist Antonio Bonfini, writing his Rerum Hungaricum decades for the Hungarian court. He says Vlad was returning to his throne when, A band of Turks fell upon him and he was slain fighting bravely. His head was cut off and sent to the Sultan as proof of his death. Clean Ottoman ambush. Honorable defeat. Second account. Laonikos Chakokondyles, Byzantine historian, alive during Vlad's reign. His histories preserve a different version entirely. Chakokondyles writes that Vlad was killed by his own men. Third account. Bishop Nicolo Modrusa, papal legate, who personally met Vlad during his Hungarian captivity. He described Vlad's physical appearance in the only known eyewitness portrait description. He also records that Vlad was assassinated by his own forces. Fourth account. Stephen the Great of Moldavia himself. In a letter dated January 10, 1477, Stephen states that Vlad's Moldavian retinue, the bodyguard Stephen had personally provided for his cousin, had been massacred alongside him. 3 of 4 contemporary accounts place the killing blow either inside Vlad's own army or in circumstances where his own men were directly involved. Only one, the Bonfini Chronicle, written for the court that had imprisoned Vlad for 12 years and then released him as a political tool, describes a clean Ottoman ambush. And that's the version that survived. That's the version that became the textbook. The other 3 were footnoted, qualified, quietly forgotten. Why? The lie was convenient for everyone. Because the Ottoman version was politically useful for every single party involved. Hungary could keep its alliance reputation intact. They hadn't backed a loser. He died fighting the enemy they all shared. The surviving Wallachian boyars could keep their lands. Their names stayed out a bit. The Ottomans could claim a clean victory over a hated enemy. The Impaler, finally dead by their hand. Basara Bliotij, the man who replaced Vlad on the throne within days, never had to answer the question of how exactly he'd managed to retake the capital so quickly after a battle that supposedly happened miles away. 4 versions. 1 survived. 3 were buried. This isn't about what happened anymore. It's about why one version was permitted to stand. Vlad was already dead by January 10, 1477. That part the documents are clear about. What they leave out is almost everything else. No contemporary record of casualty numbers, from either side. No record of the Ottoman commander who supposedly led the engagement. No agreement on where it took place. The most cited location, somewhere on the road between Bucharest and Giurgiu, is a guess, based on geography, not on any chronicler's testimony. The killing of a sitting prince, the man whose death changed the political map of southeastern Europe, took place in a location no one writing at the time bothered to record. That's not normal. That's engineered. Here's what the documents actually say. Late December 1476. A small force, perhaps 2,000 men, rides out from Bucharest under Vlad's personal command. They do not return. Within 10 days, Basara Bliote has re-entered the capital. Within 30 days, a sealed jar has begun its journey south to Constantinople. The Ottoman court receives it sometime in February 1477. The journey from Wallachia to Constantinople is approximately 400 miles. In winter, with Balkan passes choked with snow, a courier needed 3 to 4 weeks. The jar arrived on schedule. The honey was fresh, the face was recognizable, which means whoever cut the head from the body did it almost immediately, before rigor fully set, before the cold could freeze the features into something unrecognizable, which means whoever cut the head from the body had a vessel of honey ready, prepared in advance, before the body was even cold, before Vlad ever rode out of Bucharest. Someone was planning the disposal of his head while he was still alive. And that's only the first thing the standard version gets wrong. MC5, the second thing is the body. The body was never sent to Constantinople. The body was never displayed. The body was never paraded through any town. The body simply vanished from the historical record on the day Vlad died. For 500 years, every attempt to locate it has failed. The most famous location, the one identified in 19th century tradition as the Impaler's tomb, is Snagov Monastery, the fortified island church Vlad had personally rebuilt. Tradition held he was buried there, in front of the altar, beneath an unmarked stone. Pilgrims came. Local historians documented it. By the early 20th century, it was accepted as fact in popular Romanian memory. Vlad, the story went, had been carried in secret to Snagov by monks loyal to him, given a Christian burial, laid to rest under the church floor. In 1933, Romanian archaeologist Dinuvi Rossetti was given permission to excavate the tomb. June to October. They dug. Rossetti lifted the stone. Beneath it, he found no skeleton, no coffin, no royal regalia, no princely remains of any kind. His official report, published 1935, quoted ever since, contains a single line that should make you feel something cold in your stomach. Under the tombstone attributed to Vlad, there was no tomb, only many bones and jaws of horses. The most famous tomb in Romanian history was empty. Where Vlad's body should have been, there were animal bones. Horses that should have been buried in a stable yard had been placed beneath the altar of a sacred monastery, in the exact location where 5 centuries of tradition said the Impaler was supposed to lie. The arrangement was not accidental. Someone, at some point in the centuries between the killing and the excavation, removed any human remains that may have been there and replaced them with the bones of animals. His grave was a mockery. Imagine the message. Imagine the intent. Someone didn't just want him dead. Someone wanted his resting place desecrated, turned into a joke. A stable floor beneath the altar. Historians Constantine and Dinu Girescu state plainly, the whereabouts of the grave are not known. The 19th century tradition has no contemporary documentary support. It appears to have been monastic invention, possibly to attract pilgrims, possibly to consolidate prestige during a period of nationalist myth-making, which means the legend of the Snagov burial is itself a fabrication, layered on top of an actual historical disappearance. The body did vanish, that much is real. The claim it rests as Snagov is not. Romanian historian Constantin Răzășevici, in his definitive analysis published in the Journal of Dracula Studies, argues the most probable burial site is not Snagov at all. It's Comana Monastery, the religious house Vlad himself founded around 1461, near the suspected site of his death. Comana has never been excavated for this purpose. The tomb that may exist there has never been opened. The most likely resting place of Vlad the Impaler, if he has a resting place at all, is sitting undisturbed in a monastery 40 kilometers south of where everyone has been looking for the past century and a half. Later researchers, most prominently Romanian-American historian Radu Florisco, claimed in subsequent decades that a second grave near the entrance of Snagov Church contained a male skeleton with princely garments. They identified it as Vlad. The Răzășevici analysis dismantles this claim systematically. The remains were never properly authenticated. They were transferred to a museum in Bucharest and subsequently lost in the institutional chaos of the Romanian communist period. The accession records exist. The bones do not. 2 layers of erasure, the actual burial location lost in 1476. The substitute burial location, fabricated in the 19th century, debunked in the 20th, then refabricated with new claims that were also debunked. At every stage, the more closely anyone examined where Vlad the Impaler actually lies, the further the answer receded. The body is gone. The tomb attributed to him contains the bones of horses. The skeleton later claimed to be him cannot be located. The monastery most likely to actually hold him has never been investigated. Why would his own men kill him? Vlad had been betrayed before, twice. First time 1462. His younger brother Radu, raised as a hostage in the Ottoman court, converted to the Sultan's cause, led a Turkish army into Wallachia and turned the boyars against him. Vlad fled north into Hungary. He was arrested at the border on the orders of King Matthias Corvinus. Imprisoned. The official reason? A packet of letters supposedly proving Vlad was secretly negotiating with the Ottomans. Most modern historians consider those letters propagandistic forgeries. Politically convenient for Matthias to justify a shift in alliance. Vlad spent the next 12 years in Hungarian custody. Second betrayal came during that captivity. The Wallachian boyar class, under the new pretender, did everything in their power to ensure he would never return. The boyars who rode out with Vlad in December 1476 were not strangers. They were the surviving descendants of the families he had spent his first reign exterminating. He had impaled their fathers. He had confiscated their estates. He had executed their cousins. And in 1476, with Hungarian and Moldavian armies departed for the winter, they were the only soldiers he had. He knew this. The chronicles agree on that point. He knew exactly who was riding behind him, and he rode out anyway. Which raises the question the standard version refuses to ask. Why would a man who had survived 12 years of imprisonment, 2 depositions, a brother's treachery, and a personal invasion led by Mehmed II himself, take a force of 2,000 men he could not trust into a winter campaign against an enemy he could not see? unless he had no choice, unless the men he could not trust were the only men available to him, unless the political logic of his own restoration had already decided his death. The most authoritative modern account of his end, the one most historians accept, comes from Stephen the Great's letter of January 10, 1477. Stephen states that Vlad's Moldavian retinue, the personal bodyguard Stephen himself had provided, was massacred alongside the prince. The Moldavians were the only soldiers in Wallachia whose loyalty to Vlad was unquestionable. They were the men Stephen had sent specifically to protect his cousin from precisely the kind of betrayal that had ended his second reign. If the Moldavians were killed, it means they were present at the moment of Vlad's death, which means whatever happened to Vlad happened in front of the men who were guarding him, which means the Ottoman force, if it was Ottoman, somehow got past 200 elite Moldavian guards to reach the prince in the center of his own formation. Or it means the killing happened from inside the formation, from men Vlad believed were on his side. According to the history cooperative reconstruction of the most accepted version, Vlad rode out with 2,000 men. By the time he was cornered, he had only 200 soldiers actually fighting beside him. The rest had vanished. Of the 200 who stayed, only 10 survived. The story of what happened reached Stephen the Great through those 10 men. They are the source of every detail we have. Their names are not recorded. Their fates after delivering the news are not recorded. They appear in the historical record exactly long enough to deliver one report, and then they disappear. 10 witnesses, one narrative, no way to verify it. Vlad wasn't the only prince in the Balkans who had reasons to be eliminated. Matthias Corvinus, the king who had imprisoned him for 12 years and then released him in 1475 at Stephen the Great's request, had a problem. Matthias had spent a decade rehabilitating Vlad's reputation in Western Europe to justify the imprisonment. The forged letters had served their purpose. Vlad was now a Hungarian client, restored to a throne that depended on Hungarian goodwill. But once restored, Vlad had begun behaving like a sovereign rather than a vassal. He had been crowned for less than a month before he started reasserting independent authority over Wallachian commercial policy, confirming trading privileges with the Saxons of Brav on October 7th. He wasn't waiting for Hungarian instructions. For Matthias, this was the recurring problem of Vlad. Vlad never stayed inside the box his sponsors had built for him. He hadn't done it during his second reign. He was already not doing it during his third. The diplomatic edifice Matthias had constructed required Vlad to be a controllable instrument. The Vlad who actually existed was not controllable. For Stephen the Great, the calculation was different but pointed in the same direction. Stephen had sponsored Vlad's restoration as a buffer against the Ottomans on his southern flank. A Wallachian prince loyal to Moldavia would shield Stephen from the next Ottoman push. But a Wallachian prince who alienated his own boyars within weeks, who couldn't hold the country without permanent allied military presence, who was already showing signs of independent maneuvering, was a worse buffer than no buffer at all. He was a magnet for exactly the Ottoman counter-invasion that arrived in December. The boyars had their own arithmetic. They had survived Vlad's first reign by hiding, by collaborating with his enemies, by paying tribute to whoever held the throne in any given year. They knew that as long as Vlad lived, every boyar who had supported Basarab Lajochij, every boyar whose father Vlad had impaled, every boyar with a confiscated estate to recover, was on a list. They also knew that the Hungarian and Moldavian armies that had restored Vlad were now hundreds of miles away. 3 sets of interests. 1 target. The political logic was complete before the first sword was drawn. The killing took place somewhere on the road between Bucharest and Giurgiu. Late days of December 1476. Exact location never confirmed. Some historians propose the area around Snagov, where Vlad had fortified a monastery. Others propose Comana further south, where Vlad had founded another monastery near the suspected site. No contemporary chronicler names the location. No grave marker survives at either site that can be confirmed as authentic. What we know is this: Vlad was killed. His head was removed. The head was preserved in honey for the long journey south. It reached Constantinople sometime in February 1477, displayed publicly on a stake. The Ottoman court received it as proof that the man Mehmed II had been hunting for 15 years was finally dead. Mehmed accepted the proof. Mehmed had been waiting for it since 1462, when Vlad's night attack on the Ottoman camp at Targovishent had nearly succeeded in assassinating the Sultan in his own tent. Whatever the precise mechanism by which it had finally happened, Mehmed had what he wanted. The mechanism was not his concern. The body was a different matter. The body did not travel south with the head. The body did not appear in any Ottoman triumph. The body was never displayed by Basara Blaioti in Bucharest as proof of his victory. The body simply ceased to exist in the historical record on the day of the killing. The political result of his death was the result every interested party wanted. Basara Blaioti returned to the throne, held it briefly. Ottomans accepted the new arrangement. Hungary maintained the appearance of having lost a valuable client to enemy action, rather than to its own quiet calculation. Stephen of Moldavia consolidated his position as the senior Christian power in the region. Within 5 years, every major participant was dead. Mehmed II died in 1481, Stephen Bathory in 1493, Matthias Corvinus in 1490. The boyars who had ridden out with Vlad in December died over the following decade in the routine violence of Wallachian politics, most of them at the hands of factions loyal to Vlad's surviving relatives. His son Mitnia retook the throne in 58. Mitnia was assassinated in a church in Sibiu in 1500. The man who killed him was a Wallachian boyar. The cycle continued for another century. His son was murdered in a church. The version of Vlad's death that survived in the textbooks, the clean Ottoman battlefield narrative, the noble enemy, the honorable defeat, survived because every party who had any role in the actual killing benefited from its survival. Hungary needed it. Moldavia needed it. The Ottomans needed it. The boyars needed it. There was no constituency anywhere in Europe that benefited from the truth. So the truth went into the contemporary chronicles, quietly minimized over the following centuries. And the convenient version was the one that ended up in the encyclopedias. 400 years after the killing, an Irish novelist named Bram Stoker, working in the British Museum's reading room, came across a translated reference to a 15th century Wallachian prince known by the name Dracula. He used the name, he used nothing else. The fictional vampire that grew out of that borrowing has, over the past century and a half, completely consumed the historical figure beneath it. This was the second erasure. The first erasure removed the contested truth of how Vlad died. The second erasure removed the historical Vlad entirely, replaced him with a costume, the man who actually existed, the prince who was killed somewhere on a winter road between Bucharest and Giurgiu in late December 1476, whose body was never recovered, whose tomb contains the bones of horses, whose son was murdered by the same class of men who had probably murdered him, whose remains may lie undisturbed in a monastery no one has bothered to excavate. That man no longer exists in the public memory of any country. What remains is the cape. What remains is the accent. What remains is a single surviving version of his death, written by chroniclers who served the courts that benefited from his removal. The boyar families who survived the cycle prospered. Several of them produced princes of Wallachia in the following centuries. Their descendants sit today in some of the oldest noble houses of southeastern Europe. The names appear in the genealogies. The genealogies are public. No one has ever been held accountable for anything, because there is officially nothing to be held accountable for. The killing, in the official version, was the work of Ottomans on a battlefield. What 3 contemporary chroniclers actually wrote has been allowed to fade into footnotes. The monastery at Snagov is still there. The empty tomb is still there. The bones of the horses, placed there in mockery or in deliberate concealment, or for reasons no one alive can recover, are still there. The grave at Kamana, which Rezacevici identifies as the most probable actual resting place, has not been opened. The body of Vlad the Impaler, if it is anywhere identifiable, is sitting beneath a stone in a monastery 40 kilometers south of where the tourists have been visiting for the past 150 years. In the contemporary description left by Bishop Nicolo Modrusa, the papal legate who met Vlad personally during his Hungarian captivity, there is a single line about the prince's manner, quoted often, understood rarely. Modrusa wrote that Vlad's eyes were wide-set, green and watchful, and that he gave the impression of a man who had already counted his enemies. He had counted them. He knew exactly who was riding behind him, and he rode out anyway. You've just witnessed a truth history tried to bury, if that matters to you. If the idea that powerful men can erase how a prince died and get away with it for 5 centuries makes you want to look closer, hit subscribe. Don't let it stay buried, he knew. He rode out anyway.